Hello, good afternoon. This is a CBRL webinar that you're joining on the politics of water scarcity in the Levant. My name is Dr. Carol Palmer and I'm the director of CBRL. And it's my pleasure to be hosting and to be the person giving the introduction and also the chair for today. I'm just talking and also allowing people to come in to enter the Zoom room as well. We have 3 speakers. This is a panel webinar today. Dr. Hussam Hussein, Dr. Martin Koehlertz, and Dr. Majd Al-Nabar. Who will be giving presentations that are about 15 minutes each. And then we will have time for questions later at the end. We're due to end at around in 1.5 hours. The total length of the webinar is 1.5 hours. I just want to first say something about CBRL. And then follow up with some house rules, as well as starting to introduce our speakers. So CBRL, Council for British Research in the Levant, for those who don't know us, is one of the British International Research Institutes associated with the British Academy, through which we receive most of our funding. But we also depend on projects and activities that we do, and also our members who, some of whom I know are joining us today. I'm based in Amman, Jordan, where we have an institute. We also have another institute in East Jerusalem, plus a base at the British Academy as well. So today's webinar it takes the normal format of a webinar, so we invite you to ask your questions in the Q&A, which you'll find on the bottom of your screens. We also invite you, if you'd like to identify yourself, to put your name and where you're coming from in the chat, because one of the formats of the webinar is, although the panelists can see who you are, fellow attendees can't as well. We will also in the chat be adding some information about CBRL and various publications as we go along too, as we're talking today. Today's webinar is particularly topical in view of the COP26 conference, the UN Climate Change Conference that's taking place on the 31st of October to the 12th of November this year in Glasgow. And so it's very much with that in mind that we've put this panel together, and we're really looking forward to both hearing what our speakers have to say, and also to your questions as well. How we're going to run it is the speakers will speak in turn, and then we're going to do the question and answer section at the end. But please, if a question occurs to you as we're talking, please do to put it in the Q&A. I should say that we are both recording this webinar today, and also it's going out live on the CBRL Facebook page as well. So the background to this webinar is that the Middle East is one of the most water scarce regions in the world, but there's a lot more to the story of how water is used than lack of rainfall, lack of precipitation. And we brought 3 experts in the field here today to discuss this from their own particular perspectives. Dr. Hussam Hussein, who will be our first speaker, We'll talk about discourses around water scarcity in the case of Jordan. And he is a departmental lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford. And he has his PhD from the University of East Anglia with a thesis focusing on the topic that he's going to be talking to us today. Dr. Martin Kurlitz is an adjunct assistant professor to the food security program at the American University of Beirut. He acted as director of the program until 2020 and continues to teach there. And he will discuss the necessity to adopt holistic approaches to the water problem, considering all water and food sectors together. And finally, we will invite Dr. Majd Al-Naba to give the final talk on the implications of water scarcity on vulnerable communities, who's going to highlight and discuss the links between water shocks, tension, conflict, and migrations. She is the team leader and senior researcher in the Sustainable Development Pillar at the West Asia North Africa Institute, based in Jordan, but her research covers the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, and she takes a very multidisciplinary view across the Wana region, encompassing many fields in her studies: climate change, gender, water, and she received her Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands and semi-arid, France. And she's also speaking to us based on her experience, as well as her PhD as well, her Doctor of Philosophy. I should say, I think I didn't mention that Martin has his PhD, I think, from King's College London. And I just wanted to mention today briefly the geographer, the late Tony Allen, who died in April this year, who was very influential in the field that we're talking in, especially the concept of virtual water. And I found at CBRL that many of the researchers who come to us to speak on this topic are very often either a student of his, as Martin was, or they are a student of his, as our first speaker, Hussam Hussein, is. And I think with that, I will give Hussam the floor to start talking to us on his topic. Welcome, Hussam, thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carol, for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today to share some of my research on the issue of water scarcity, especially in the case of Jordan. So as a general background, the focus of this presentation is on Jordan and on water scarcity. 40% of water resources in Jordan are of transboundary nature. Groundwater resources are over-extracted and over-exploited, and the level of groundwater resources is rapidly decreasing, both in terms of quality and also of quantity. When we look at the lower part of the Jordan River, the flow of the river has decreased enormously compared to how it was about 100 years ago, by about 97%. And this also is impacting the biodiversity, which has decreased by about 50%. This is negatively impacting also the Dead Sea, which we know is decreasing in terms of surface by more than 1/3 of its surface, but also in terms of the quantity and the height of the Dead Sea, which is decreasing by 1 meter per year, more or less. And in this context, I found that discourses and narratives and the way we understand the problem is really important in shaping how we frame the solutions and the policy solutions. When we look at the country, here we have a map of Jordan. We can also see that transboundary resources are very important. I mentioned that 40% of the surface water resources are, of the water resources in the country are shared. Agreements, therefore, and water diplomacy is important. And here we have 3 years, which represent the 3 agreements that Jordan signed with neighboring countries on the management and the governance of transboundary water resources. In particular, the 1987 is the year of the latest agreement between Jordan and Syria on the Yarmouk River. In 1994, as part of the peace treaty, the agreement between Jordan and Israel, or also on the lower part of the Jordan River. And finally, the 2015 agreement between Jordan and Saudi Arabia on the non-renewable groundwater resources of the DC aquifer. When it comes to the water resources and the water supply used in Jordan, here we can see that 54% of the water supply comes from groundwater resources, 33% from surface water resources, and 13%, and it's increasing, from treated wastewater. So we can see that while most of the waters, an important percentage of water resources in Jordan is mainly surface water resources, most of the water resources that are being used are instead of groundwater resources. And this is for different reasons. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, is that the surface water resources, the main rivers in Jordan are the Yarmouk River and the Jordan River, and they're both shared with neighboring countries. And therefore, it results easier for Jordan to use groundwater resources, especially those groundwater resources and aquifers that are all within Jordan. Therefore, no need to negotiate with neighboring countries. In this slide, we can see the current water uses of the water resources. And in particular, these data are from 2017 governmental data, and shows that an important percentage of about 52% are used for domestic water demand. And this has been increasing in the past, also due to an increased population, as we will see in the next slide. However, we can also see that 45% is used for agriculture and a small percentage, only 3%, for industry. And as I was mentioning earlier, we can see here that 59% is surface water, while 27% is groundwater and 14% treated wastewater in 2017. So as I was mentioning, it's easier, while most of the water sources are surface water resources, it's easier to use groundwater resources as so earlier. But I think it's important to see how the role of the agriculture in Jordan. And we can see that 90% of the food consumed in the country is imported. So that's something important to bear in mind. But when we see at the role, when we look at the role of agriculture in the country, we can see that only 3% of the GDP comes from agriculture. And this, obviously, it depends also on to what extent we consider, what is agriculture when we look at it as a sector. If we also include all the supply chain, then it would probably increase to 15 or 20%. And this also links to the labor force by sector, but official data would say that it's about 3%. So it's important to consider, and that's the approach that I use to look at discourses. So how the problem is framed in order to understand how to solve it. And so it's important to consider how the discourses of water scarcity are framed, and frame the issue of water scarcity in order to understand, firstly, the political economy behind discourses, but also how policies are come to be and are formed and are shaped. So this is why I decided to look at the discourse of water scarcity, especially in the case of Jordan, because Jordan is said to be the second most water scarce country in the world. So Jordan is, has indeed a problem of water scarcity. now it's the second, used to be the fourth. I mean, it really depends on also which indicators and measures we use, but it's, I mean, objectively, it seems to be an important issue for the country. And so what I did was to try to unpack and to try to understand how this discourse of water scarcity is formed, and also the different nuances within the discourse, whether there are different sub-discourses or different diverging views on the framing of this discourse of water scarcity. And therefore, to try to understand how people and policymakers understand the issue of water scarcity, why there is water scarcity in the country, what are the causes behind it, in order to understand the policies that are being implemented or suggested, or what should maybe be the best policies to solve the issue of water scarcity. And therefore, really the link between the discourses and the policies, which appeared to be quite relevant during my research. And therefore, the data collection really focused on analyzing the written documentation on the reports from the relevant ministries, in particular the Ministry of Water and Irrigation, but also other governmental institutions, as well as the writings from academics, donors, agencies, international organizations on the issue of water scarcity. And then I followed up with semi-structured interviews to those that developed and wrote these reports to really understand, and also the policymakers to really understand how and why they decide to frame the issue in certain ways and to adopt certain solutions. And therefore, the target of my research was mainly, for the interviews, was mainly the donors, agencies, the members of the parliament, as well as media, newspapers, journalists, academics, both based in Jordan and abroad, governmental officials, diplomats, NGOs, students, farmers, and different users of water resources. And what I found was that there is indeed a consensus on the issue of water scarcity. So everyone, I mean, almost everyone, all the people that I spoke to, agreed that there is an issue of water scarcity and that Jordan is experiencing this water shortage. However, they disagreed on the emphasis of the different reasons behind the water scarcity. And so here we can see two narratives that compose this discourse of water scarcity. On the one hand, we have a dominant, I would say, which is bigger, the one on the left, narrative or sub-discourse of water scarcity that basically argues that there is water scarcity due to limited water resources, and we need to increase the water resources in order to match the growing demand. And the causes behind these limited water resources are mainly the population growth, immigration and refugees. And the argument that was made was basically that in 1946, when Jordan became independent, Jordan had a population of about 500,000 people. And about 12 years ago, before the Syrian crisis, we had a population of 7 to 8 millions, and now a population of about 10 to 11 million. So there has indeed been an increase of the population, which also led to an increase in the demand. And then another reason, the one on the left, is that the unfair sharing with neighboring countries. So a perception that the sharing of the Yarmouk River and of the of the Jordan River water resources is quite unfair for different reasons. Then, I mean, it also differs according to who I spoke with. Certain people emphasized the issues on the Yarmouk and the relations with Syria, while others emphasized the relations with Israel. Also depending to some extent on to what extent they were close to the Yarmouk or to the Jordan River. And then other two reasons emphasize, one, the climate change that is increasing and is seen as an additional pressure to water resources and to water scarcity in different ways. For instance, in the precipitation patterns, but also in the recharge of the groundwater resources. And then also some other people emphasize the aridity and the low precipitation in the country by saying that, I mean, it's quite normal and natural to have water scarcity because Jordan is mainly a desertic country based in the Middle East, which is quite of a desertic region. So it's quite normal to have a water scarcity. And therefore, here we can see a pattern of reasons that drive and indicate that we have water scarcity due to external issues and reasons, external to the country, external to the government in terms of responsibility. So either due to the nature and the environment, so climate change or low precipitation, or due to neighboring countries from where we have people and immigrants and refugees that come to Jordan, or that neighboring countries that do not respect or that do not allow Jordan to have the fair share of water on the neighboring, on the shared water resources. And therefore, really the idea behind this framing is that Jordan has limited water resources for these reasons, and we need to increase the supply. And therefore, the solutions that are suggested, as we will see in the next slide, are mainly on increasing the supply. We need to increase the supply because we have an increasing demand, and there's nothing we can do. We can just increase the supply. The other, and quite unsurprisingly, the people that emphasized these reasons are usually people that are either working in governmental institutions or newspapers and mass media. They are quite aligned with the mainstream positions of the government. On the other hand, we have another sub-discourse or narrative that indicates that we have water scarcity, but this is seen mainly due to mismanagement, and therefore we need to better manage the water resources. So by managing better the water resources, we could decrease the water scarcity, and then in case we can look at water supply increasing. But firstly, we should better manage the water resources. And they indicate and point mainly to three reasons. One is the non-revenue water due to leakages and physical losses. So yeah, pipelines are old and we need to really rehabilitate the network. The other one is pointing to the illegal wells and illegal connections by saying that we need to, so like there's a percentage, about 30–40% of non-revenue water that includes both leakages, physical losses, and illegal wells and illegal uses. And we need to close illegal wells and stop the illegal uses, yeah, and to decrease the mismanagement. Finally, we have the unsustainable, so-called unsustainable agricultural water use that points to in different directions. So on the one hand, it points to the type of crops. So having, for instance, tomatoes or bananas in certain parts of the country is seen as not very wise from a water perspective, especially if then these products are then exported to other countries. So as Dr. Caro was mentioning earlier, late Professor Tony Allen emphasized the importance of looking at virtual water, which is the amount of water embedded in any good or service. And he said that water scarce countries should try to import amount of water, virtual water. So import basically agricultural products that are very water rich, and try not to export agricultural products, but rather try to export services or industrial product that uses little water. Or, for instance, be wise on choosing what to crop. For instance, dates and certain type of dates that we have also here in the Jordan Valley are probably more appropriate than exporting watermelons or tomatoes. And the other one is the tariffing system. So trying to be wise in the type of trying to decrease mismanagement and water demand by increasing water tariffs, especially for the agricultural sector. But I'm sure probably Dr. Martin Kollefs will touch more on food security and water and food. So looking at, and just to finish on this, on the water mismanagement sub-discourse, the people that emphasized these three reasons are mainly coming from the donors community or academics mainly based abroad, or international organizations, or some NGOs. And we can see that the blame in this case is mainly on either the users in Jordan or on the Ministry of Water or governmental or Ministry of Agriculture. So like more on persons and stakeholders within the country. However, it's also important to remark that they all acknowledge also the other causes. So it's not that those people who neglect and deny the 4 reasons that we mentioned for the water insufficiency narrative. They would just say emphasize more the water mismanagement narrative, and also the other way around. So also people in the government would acknowledge these 3 reasons, but they would emphasize the 4 reasons that I mentioned earlier. So the solutions on the supply side are so increasing supply, those that have been mentioned and supported and strongly emphasized in the, for instance, National Water Strategy, are the DC Canal, so using groundwater from the DC aquifer, which is non-renewable and is shared with Saudi Arabia, which has been implemented about 5-6 years ago and is now operational. But it's pumping water from a non-renewable water resource 300 kilometers north to Amman and the northern part of the country. So it's also very energy intense. And then the Red Dead Canal, which has shaped form many times in the past 20 years, but currently is mainly, and the project is mainly a national water carrier that would desalinized water in Aqaba in Jordan and pumping this desalinized water north to the northern part of the country where most of the population resides and most of the water needs are. And then building dams, however, like, yeah, I mean, I think most, I mean, I'm not sure there's any place left for new dams, and then increasing the treated wastewater, which is something that is being supported by all stakeholders. And all these projects are going ahead. The Red Dead Canal is going ahead, as mentioned in the new shape. The DC is operational, and treated wastewater also is increasing and increasing. On the demand side, instead, the tariffing system, especially for removing subsidies for the agricultural sector, is, as well as regulations on the type of crops, is something that has been tried at times, but usually has not been approved and did not manage to pass all the stages and steps in the legislative process in the country for different reasons, but mainly for the oppositions and the lobbying of large farmers. When it comes to better conserving water and therefore trying to change the behavior of people, this is something that is being done quite successfully in the country and is being supported by all stakeholders. For instance, through including mentions of water, on the importance of conserving water in textbooks, in schools, or also through religious leaders. So I think my time is running slowly out, but I think we can conclude this with slide on really emphasizing the need to holistically try to understand the problem, and therefore bringing different stakeholders together to try to look at the problem together from different perspectives. So it's important to have, for instance, the Minister of Water together with one of the Agriculture and Energy discussing and trying to find solutions together, and also ensuring that the strategies, the national strategies are really coherent in the different sectors. The need for interdisciplinary research to try to solve these complex problems. And therefore, obviously, we cannot just rely on political scientists or on hydrogeologists, but we really need to bring all the disciplines and geographers together to work together, also both in terms of disciplines, but also nexus. And that's probably something that the other 2 speakers will also touch on. Therefore, for instance, the water, energy, food nexus, but also looking at water as how it links with other sectors and issues. And finally, the need to contextualize the water issues within the political economy, and therefore really trying to understand the different interests and the different positions of the different stakeholders and users of the water sectors. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions at the very end.
So thank you very much, Hussam, and Martin is with us and will be our next speaker. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important session. It's been already mentioned several times that we lost a giant earlier this year, Tony Allen, and we're very saddened about it. However, if I'm not mistaken, I can see in the list of attendees 3 people who work with Tony. One is Raya Stefan, who's the editor of Water International. I'd say one of the key journals, academic journals in water management. Then we have Eli El-Haj, who did his PhD with Tony after a long career in banking. I still think that his PhD had the best title ever. It was on Saudi Arabia, and it's called Camels Don't Fly, Deserts Don't Bloom. So I think this nicely captures the whole issue. And then we have, I'd say, the legitimate successor, intellectual successor of Tony Allen, Chris Perry, former World Bank, and now a very influential, independent, however, voice on water management, in particular water accounting. So welcome everyone. I don't know the others, so it's my fault. I'm very sorry, but I'd like to welcome these 3 people in particular. My presentation is, well, more about food security, but I'm going to turn to water later. And I called it Food Security Threats to Turbulent Regions. One reason is actually one of the final conversations I had with Tony Allen was that he concluded that water is just a subsector or subfield in food systems research. And I tend to agree, because it is very much about food security. Let me get started. I don't know, here we go. Why is food security a make it or break it issue in the Arab world? Well, first of all, the Arab world is one of the most food import dependent regions in the world. Up to 80% of the food is imported. In certain countries such as the Gulf, it's nearing about 100%. And at the same time, domestic production is limited because of water scarcity and land degradation. Food import dependency may pose development challenges to the region. Rural areas will be especially affected by economic decline. This is already visible, and this is only going to continue in the next few years and decades. And one of the consequences also in relation or as a result of water scarcity is more urbanization. What are the specific key problems and threats we face? First of all, and I think we always need to start with this issue because it's so essential, demographic change. I shall explain later what I mean by this. Also, food production cannot meet consumption. Food import dependency means reliance on the global market. It's not always an easy global market. I think those of you who are joining us from the United Kingdom know what it means to be dependent on trade. Like every other country, it can have or it can pose problems. The region is already facing nutrition challenges, not enough proteins available to consumers, and environmental challenges are epic. Rural areas are prone to poverty as well, and at the moment, only irrigation provides income. Yet water scarcity and land degradation are key bottlenecks. Let me underpin this with a few slides, because I think this is important. We've done this study together with my colleague Musa McKee and Mark Mulligan from King's College in London for the Manara research project, which was looking at the Middle East and North Africa and the geopolitics of this region. And we looked at, first of all, at demography, what is going to happen there? What's the situation? So, and according to the UN numbers, we can see that by 2100, this region will have double the population compared to Europe. And if we think back to the 1950s, it was very much a mismatch. Europe had almost five times as many inhabitants as the region. And the big question is, what is it going to lead to? Does it mean that the region will only see poverty, or is it also perhaps also a source of power, that this region is growing and Europe is stagnating? Actually, as we speak, we see the break even between Europe and the MENA region, with about 600 million people living in both areas or both regions of this world. So the region is growing as a takeaway message, and it's growing fast. And in fact, 3 countries stand out. One is Egypt. From today, roughly 100 million people, it will increase to 200 million people by the end of the century. Then we have Sudan, from about 40 million people to 140 million people by the end of the century, and Iraq from about 60 million people to 110, 120 by the end of this century. And other countries, including the riparian countries in the Jordan River Basin, are also growing. By 2100, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan will have about 41 million people, which is seriously going to pose questions to the sustainability of this part of the world. When we look at a driving factor for agricultural suitability, we of course need to look at agricultural suitability. There is, some areas have some agricultural suitability. The more green it gets, the more red it gets, the more suitability there is. Most of the areas in the region have a moderate, if little, suitability. I always like to point people at one country which is often overlooked. It's Mauritania. Mauritania has a potential. And of course, in the Levant, there is a potential, and Turkey as a potential provider of agricultural commodities to the region. Having said this, of course, in North Africa, there's also potential in the Maghreb, but urbanization is literally eating away also agricultural land, because cities are expanding in areas where there could be agricultural production. Then, of course, water constraints. Across the region, we see very significant water constraints. Again, everything where you see a dark blue, there's heavy water constraints. The more red it gets, the more water there is. And again, there is little water available, at least from natural rainfall. There are, as we know, rivers, such as the Jordan River Basin, such as the Euphrates and Tigris River system, and the Nile Basin. But as we know, they are highly contested. I shall later talk about the Euphrates and Tigris briefly, because I think it deserves more attention. As you can also see here, the Fertile Crescent is very well depicted, and it is perhaps one of the last opportunities for the region. Land degradation, according to Arab Spatial, we have heavy land degradation across the region. Wherever there's irrigation, the more land degradation we can see. The Nile Delta stands out, but also agricultural regions in the new lands of Egypt. And again, the Euphrates and Tigris, these are the areas which are heavily degraded in terms of saline soils. More than 75% of the soils are saline in those parts of the region. And as I mentioned before, we have this tendency that people move to cities. I would say the region is becoming another Lebanon. When we look at Lebanon, we can see that the urban area has more or less increased from north of Junior to all the way down nearly to Saida. The coast is one metropolitan area, although 30, 40 years ago, these were still villages. But this trend is not just a phenomenon in Lebanon, it's happening everywhere. For those of you who are from Jordan, they will know that Jordan is also heavily urbanizing. And by 2050, in between 85% of people in the major countries to 90% will live in cities. And that's, of course, another worrying trend. Across the region, it's slightly better because of certain countries such as Mauritania and Somalia, which is also included here. We see about 70% of people then living in cities. But it's a major challenge because cities require different food systems, and cities, also face potential challenges internally because people also need work. And the Arab city may at some point become a hotspot also for tensions or clashes over work, over opportunities. Another consequence of food insecurity is food production and consumption. What we can see here is total cereal consumption doesn't meet demand. The gap is widening. And it's also particularly widening in terms of food and animal imports. It's especially placing a heavy burden on budgets. So therefore, in this region, this gap is widening. I deliberately didn't include any data from the past 18 months because I think the picture is quite distorted at the moment due to the pandemic. But we've worked with UNESCO on this issue, and right now it doesn't really look good, but hopefully there will be some or a decrease or an increase in production over the next few months again, which were, those agricultural production was also impaired by the pandemic, so therefore it's a distorted picture at the moment. And if we look at the different crops and the different commodities, cereals are the problem with roots and tubers of potatoes and so on. The region is actually quite self-sufficient. Surely those of you who live in the region always hear about reports that Egyptian potatoes are imported to various countries, although people say, why don't we consume our own potatoes? So Egypt is actually a very important provider. About 30% of agricultural production is due to Egypt alone. It's a very crucial agricultural powerhouse in the region. Meat, we see a steady gap evolving because it's difficult to produce meat, and also milk is facing a similar, not as dramatic picture. The gap is much smaller, but nevertheless, countries are in need of further imports, and therefore also they need to provide food from the world market. And over the last 15 years or so, 13 years, we've seen two major events which happened in 2007-08 and 2010-11. Those were the food price spikes. And this slide very well captures what happens when there are food price spikes, when food prices go up. During the first one, we saw some political unrest in the region. And then during the second food price spike, there were even more, or actually quite a number of political events. I'm not saying food security or food insecurity is responsible for the Arab Spring, but I would surely say it contributed to the Arab Spring, to political unrest, because people were unhappy with what was delivered and provided by governments. Having said this, over the last 18 months, despite heavy increases in food prices globally, we haven't seen the political unrest. So countries have apparently learned from the food price spikes of 2007-08 and 2010-11. Another important issue is undernutrition. The region doesn't produce sufficient protein to its population. It's improving compared to the early 1990s, but still there is a lack of protein, in particular in the poorer countries. And that also then means that it impacts, for example, children. It may lead to stunting and other factors which affect children when they are undernourished in the early years of life. Let's return to water, because I find this slide extremely telling and important. Many in the region discuss the option of rain-fed agriculture. Perhaps that's the way out, how to improve rain-fed agriculture. But if we look at the region and at the issue around poverty, then we can actually see that only irrigated agriculture provides important livelihoods, because those who irrigate produce mainly fruits, vegetables, and cash crops. And they do this on 2% of the entire land area in the region, and it's about 17% of the agricultural population. If we look at other systems, so for example, highland mixed systems where, you know, some pastoralists often produce cereals, legumes, sheep, or sheep. Poverty is extensive, and the same applies to dryland mixed system and also pastoral system. And those farmers only get out of poverty if they have off-farm income. So basically, if they do another job. And that's a major concern. We have studies in Beirut on the northern Bekaa, where we interviewed farmers, and the farmers told us the only reason why they're still in agriculture is because they need to repay the debt they accumulated with banks. Other than this, it doesn't really make sense from a financial perspective. And also, water is a key concern. So if you don't have access to irrigation, one can say you're screwed, or you have another job, or you do whatever, ecotourism, that's of course also an option. But the actual business of producing food in the region is not very profitable, and that's a major concern, of course. Global implications, you know, we can always talk about this region just, you know, from a regional perspective, but I'd say, of course, the Arab region has a global impact. First of all, if food security is not addressed, then food insecurity may lead to further political instability. Hungry people may adopt radical solutions. And poor nutrition leads to development challenges, rates of stunting and wasting, as I mentioned. Life chances of Arab children may be impaired from an early age. And the region which is most directly affected is Europe, because it is the Arab world is our closest neighbor, and we should pay attention to the Arab region. However, is it all doom and gloom? And I would argue not necessarily, and I would like to use the Euphrates and Tigris basin as an example. The Euphrates and Tigris has found increasing media attention due to severe water scarcity over the last few years. Water scarcity in the downstream area around Basra, where the Shia Arabs live. And the reason for it is, of course, in part the GAP project, Turkey's dam building, because the vast majority of water is captured by Turkey, because in the basin, 90% of water comes from Turkey and 10% from Syria. And those dams, which are not just in Turkey, but also in Iraq and Syria, have literally dried up the downstream river basin. And one issue one should be concerned about is ethnic tensions, because they may escalate further without new approaches. And this is something I would like to end on. But before that, I'd quickly like to show you what I mean. On the left-hand side, you can see the different dams which were built, in particular in Turkey. The latest one is the Ilishu Dam in the Kurdish areas in Turkey. And on the right-hand side, we see the ethnic diversity of Iraq. And in Iraq, in the downstream areas, we've got the Shia Arabs, and in the north, we've got the Kurds, and in the west, we've got the Sunni Arabs. And if we think about this region at large, you know, we will surely all know that the increasing tensions between Shia Arabs and or Shia Islam and Sunni Islam is a major concern for the future of our entire globe, because if something escalates in the region, it could have very negative effects on the rest of the world. So Iraq could be one of the countries which may be first affected, and water could, in fact, inflame further ethnic divisions. However, what we did, and I mentioned this project before, during the Menara research project, is we looked at a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for the Euphrates and Tigris basin, to understand whether it's all doom and gloom. And when we look at the strengths in the Euphrates and Tigris basin, we actually quickly realized there are there's quite good infrastructure. Then everything you see in green means accessibility. So we have, people have access to the next market within 3 hours, which is very important, especially if you work also in agriculture. GDP is, to a lesser extent, a strength there, but there's an opportunity for nature-based tourism, so ecotourism, which is also heavily promoted by donors. And in the northern part of the basin, there's per capita availability, and more in the southern part, there's also per capita agricultural productivity. So there are also opportunities, also per capita agricultural productivity is, as you can see, also not bad in the northern part. In terms of weaknesses, there is seasonality is one of the key weaknesses, and also risk of natural hazards. And here we have also per capita agricultural scarcity, in particular in Syria and in the northwestern part of Iraq. In terms of opportunities, natural capital security is a major opportunity. There is an agricultural potential further upstream in the Euphrates and Tigris. And climate change is not just posing problems, it also means increased rainfall for the southern part of Iraq. And finally, there is this solar energy potential, and there's some, very little though, wind energy potential. And finally, to follow up on the SWOT analysis, the threats are in part population density, border proximity, climate change where there's less rainfall, and of course governance challenges. So what we're trying to show with this SWOT analysis is that if we look at a basin such as Euphrates and Tigris, perhaps it's worthwhile thinking beyond or outside the box, beyond current paradigms on water. And I'd like to point this to you as my final message. Should the region be a large-scale agricultural producer, or should it not make use of its water resources for other purposes, other sectors? Especially the pandemic showed how concentrated global supply chains are. You know, most of your ibuprofen, for example, is produced somewhere in East Asia. And when there's a problem, for example, with trade routes, then, you know, we might run out of, for example, pharmaceuticals, but also other key commodities in our global supply chains. Should we not look at this region, or should we not also perhaps use water scarcity as an opportunity to move outside the agricultural sector, to industrialize instead of agriculturalize, to also be slightly relaxed about the world market, because the world market is still strong. Russia is going to be the key provider of cereals in the world over the next few decades, and climate change will actually aid this. For those of you who would like to read more about it, just read the Financial Times. They write about it every 4 or 6 weeks, that Russia is going to be the next big provider of agricultural commodities. So my message is we need to move away from agriculture, from just food security, which is domestically achieved, but to look at other opportunities, such as changing the economies at large away from their present state towards more industrialized economies, and then perhaps also benefit in Europe from a more productive Middle East and North Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, and I'm going to move on swiftly to our final speaker. Thank you. Majd, if you would like to give us your presentation.
Thank you very much, Carol, and good afternoon, everyone. I thank you for having me today. Carol, thank you for the introduction. As Carol mentioned today, I will highlight the linkages between climate change, water shocks, migration, and conflict in Wana MENA region. Some of the information that I will be mentioning today is based on a background report we prepared at Wana for the World Bank to support their recent publication, Ebb and Flow Volume 2. But before starting with the presentation, just please allow me to introduce the institute that I work for, WANA Institute. We are a policy think tank organization located in Amman, Jordan, but we have a regional mandate in WANA region. We try to provide research based on evidence and validated opinion in several sectors as human security, sustainable development, where we tackle the environmental sector, economic growth, and social justice. We are operating under the chairmanship of His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal. So, as I mentioned today, I will speak about the implication of water shocks in environment community. We'll start by providing a general overview about water situation in MENA region, then the effect of climate change in our region and how this climate change caused several water shocks. Will define these water shocks, and then to integrate these water shocks with the interstate migration, IDPs that happened inside the countries, and the external migration within the countries. And then the linkage, if there is a link between these water shocks and the conflict that happened, that's still happening in MENA region. So the Middle East and North Africa region captured many of the issues surrounding water and migration. It is very well known that water availability and accessibility are essential factors to achieve any country's development. Our region is the most water scarce in the world, with more than 60% of its population living with a very high stress area. The global water withdrawal have more than doubled since the 16 without any sign of slowing down. Worldwide, there are 17 countries that are suffering from extremely high water stress based on water stress index. 12 out of these 17 are located in MENA region, and unfortunately 5 out of these 12 countries are located in the Levant area. Regionally, Jordan is the most water stressed countries based on water stress index, as also my colleague Dr. Hussam mentioned in the first presentation, and it's followed by Libya and Algeria from the North Africa. The availability and accessibility of water resources are normally associated with population growth, with accelerated demand that's already linked with the population growth, food insecurity, insufficient management of nature resources, socio-economic fragmentation and political fragmentation, as well as climate change. And I believe this might answer one of the questions in the box that was highlighted by Dr. Stefan, related why we are not achieving any acceleration toward water management. I believe these factors contributed directly to that slow motion and water resources management, not only in Jordan, but also the whole region. The effect of climate change in the region has been noticed since the 18th. Drought, earthquake, floods, and storms occurs have been increased dramatically. It's predicted that deforestation rates will be increased by 4%, annual temperature will be increased by 2 to 6% in the future, and crop yield will deteriorate and will be decreased based on the increase in the annual temperature. Natural disaster, globally, it has doubled since the 18th, but in MENA region, it has tripled. As I said, drought and flash flood has occurred. Their requirement has been increased dramatically. Now it's every year we notice several drought in the region, flash flood, wildfires, frost event, etc. So, historically, the region has also experienced a high level of intrastate and interstate migration, and most recently increase in the level of forced displacement. As example, in 2020, there are an estimated of 7.2 million refugees and asylum seekers in the region, of whom about 2.7 were hosted in MENA region, and 12.4 million internally displaced persons inside the same country. The regional human mobility or the human mobility in MENA region can be divided, if I can say it like this, in three main patterns. First, displacement caused by war, political unrest, food security, natural disaster, and climate change. But also we have asylum seeker, and the third pattern is labor migrant, where a lot of people that from Jordan and Lebanon, for example, migrate to Gulf in order to find a better job opportunity and better socio-economic life. Today I will focus on the first, displacement, and the one that's related with the environmental challenge, such as water shocks. We defined water shocks as the occasion that happened due to climate change, as a drought, flash flood, salinity, wildfire, frost pollutions, etc., and seawater intrusion in some countries, as in the Gulf countries. So let me provide you with some examples of water shocks, where did it occur, and its effect on communities. Starting with Syria, before March 2011, Syria has always been known as a food self-sufficient country when it's come to food security. But since the beginning of the 18th century, the fluctuation of precipitation events have been noticed, and this was associated with frequent drought season between 2006 and 2010. The peak of the drought season has happened between 2007 and 2008. The average precipitation has been decreased to 50%. In north to South Syria, in Al-Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, Homs, rainfed agriculture has shifted to groundwater-based agriculture. Accordingly, there were decrease in water table and deterioration in water quality due to this kind of activity. So that results in agriculture failure. Accordingly, 40,000 to 60,000 families migrated to other areas as Elpo and Daraa. Moreover, a flash flood has occurred in 2018 and 19 in Al Hol and Arisha camp, and this flash flood led to flee of around 72,000 individuals. Other story in Iraq, the frequent drought that happened in the Levant region, not only in Syria and Iraq, but also in other countries as Lebanon and Jordan. But in Iraq in 2007 and 2009, it hit the northern area of Iraq, while in 2010 and 2011, it hit the south governorate as the Qar Misan al-Qadisiyya. And accordingly, in Misan governorate, there is rural to urban migration happens in the area due to this water scarcity and drought condition. And it was also associated with poor water management and increase in salinity. Accordingly, 6,800 families were migrated due to several conditions, including loss of crop and livestock mortality. In Yemen, there's tropical storms happened in 2008 and 2010. It's led to 20,000 migrants, and in Lebanon, flash floods that happened in 2019 led to 40. The number is wrong in the presentation. It's 41,000 IDPs. So the question that's or before the question, but who are the most affected? Who are the most vulnerable towards climate change, and the one that we need to increase their resilience towards climate change? From my opinion, they are small farmers, because they are the one who depend on the agriculture sector. They are waiting to harvest their cultivation and sell it in the market. But due to climate change or water shocks, drought, frost occasion, a lot of the production were destroyed, and farmers didn't get benefit from that. And they eventually have to migrate in some areas internally between place to place to find other job opportunity. The poorest are the most vulnerable toward the climate change. They can't, even if they want to adapt and to mitigate with the water shocks, they can't due to financial restriction. the less informative and knowledgeable for sure, small household, and the people who live near the sea, rangeland, and frosted due to seawater intrusion and wildfire, etc. And also who live in the downstream of the water stream, because if floods happened, it will be from upstream to downstream. The acceleration of water flows will be increased as much as we move to downstream, especially if there is a high slope. So again, back to the question, is there a link between water shocks and human mobility? Based on a survey that was conducted by the World Bank in 2010, more than 25% of the IDP in Iraq cited that water scarcity as the main reason for displacement, and also the main reason for preventing them to return back to their place of origin. In a follow-up survey in 2019, the IOM in Iraq identified 21,000 IDPs from the southern and central governorates who were displaced due to a drinking water issue, as I mentioned before, caused by high salinity and content in waterborne disease. But talking about the southern governorate, yes, we have ongoing water challenges, but it's not only related to water accessibility or availability, but it's also linked to access to basic services as safe drinking water, sanitation, facilities, housing, energy, education, and healthcare. And they consider that as a pull factor among the IDPs and the southern governorates of Iraq. In other countries like Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, and Yemen, they said that there is a water-related factor that's not the primary driver on human mobility. There is other factors that accelerate their mobility, such as job security and socioeconomic situation of the household, and they are more important factor comparing to the nature disaster or availability of water and food. As I mentioned at the beginning, all of these centers that I'm providing, answering that question, it was conducted for a background paper for the World Bank. One of the tools that we use, we interviewed key experts in the field of climate change, migration, and conflict. And thank you, Dr. Hussam, you were participated in one of the interviews for that report. So based on experts, they agreed that water factor had affected migration in the region, but however, they also ranked other factors such as war, unemployment, and corruption as much more influence drive to migration comparing to water-related issue. And when we asked them to rank these factors in terms of most uncertainty about their influence and their connection with the migration, the expert identified high temperature and high risk of natural disaster as having the most uncertain again influence on migration. Linkage between water shocks and conflict. Did water shocks cause conflict or the opposite? Actually, it's the opposite. Conflict has caused significant damage to water infrastructure, not only water infrastructure, but also energy infrastructure as well. Electricity, as this service has been targeted in all conflict due to the pumping and etc., but not the opposite. There's a lot of scholars that studies that the conflict that happened in Syria, and some tried to find a direct link between the conflict and the drought that I mentioned that happened between 2006 to 2010, 2011. But unfortunately, there isn't like a clear evidence of that, especially that the how we can call it, the evolution that happened in Syria. It was created by young, educated people, not from farmers. So back, when evaluating conflict drives and their uncertainty, experts agreed that mistrust of government, external intervention, unemployment, and corruption are all influence drivers. And across the expert, climate-related water risk as a drought were deemed to have little or no influence on conflict risk. So in conclusion, there are various interlinked factors stimulate displacement, human mobility, interstate migration in the region. Water shock are one of them, but we can't consider it as a direct one. Normally, it's associated with economic, social, political, and stability factor. Last but not least, how we can adapt and mitigate toward these water shocks and climate change. In my opinion, we need to increase countries' resilience towards climate change through developing technology and tools to predict the effect of this climate change, increase the preparedness level and adaptive capacity at state level and at a national level, at a regional level, and adopt disaster management and risk reduction approach. We also need what I mentioned is at state level, but at individual level, at house level, at a community level, we need to increase the resilience of the most affected people, the most vulnerable people, by providing them with the required knowledge, capacity building, provide them information about the climate change, the science beneath climate change, how they can adapt, how they can mitigate, how they can cope more with the situation and survive with it. And to do that, we need that technology, and we need to make this technology friendly to the user, to the end user, so they can use it in a good way. Last but not least, since I spoke a lot about farmers and agriculture system, I believe subsidies and compensation should be provided to the people who are affected from the climate shocks in order to decrease the potential economic and social tension. Thank you very much. Back to you, Carol.
Thank you very much for that overview. And we've gone from the very high level, the regional level, down to the household. And thank you very much for highlighting how it affects, how water scarcity affects people's lives directly, and what the Institute and people are doing to alleviate some of this. I'd like to invite our three panelists to open up their videos, and we can come to the questions that people have been submitting in the Q&A. And if you have more, please do address them to the Q&A now. So we had, I'm just going to start from the top, but I'm going to initially have a question for each of our speakers. Something that you, Dr. Majd, had started to answer is these that seem very familiar. Essentially, these seem very familiar water insufficiency problems already identified 20 or more years ago. But why is the situation not changing? To all our speakers, maybe to say, why does this seem such a consistent and intractable issue? Majd, do you want to say something more before?
For sure. Since I'm a Jordanian and I'm living in Jordan, and I work directly with water resource management with different ministries, and directly at the field with different farmers and different community-based organizations. When I look at water situation, I can't consider only one parameter, which is water management. There is a lot of parameters that inside this equation: climate change, population growth, the refugees influx. If we go back in years and calculate how many refugees were popped up to Jordan, and with the limited water resources, and we need to meet the demand and the supply for them. So there is a lot of challenges meeting and providing all the people with drinking water resources, while in the past Jordan, let's say, promote the agriculture sector by providing several licenses to groundwater-based agriculture. But then there is a lot of political situation that's happened around us that affect our water availability per person, and we have to decrease that in order to meet the increased end demand. So what I'm trying to say, when we look at water resource management, we can't only look at in silos. We have to look at the whole equation, everything that's affecting the region, from political situation, from economical situation, and the more important thing, and I believe Dr. Hussam will agree with me, is the social aspect and the economical aspect, because there is a lot of people are considering agriculture are the main source for their cultivation, for their live, and as mentioned, a lot of water that are pumped in agriculture sector is coming from groundwater resources. So we need to decrease that amount of water, but in the same time, we don't want to close the farms. We don't want to stop the economical revenue to the farmers. There is a lot of initiatives that already is implemented in the field. For example, providing farmers with treated wastewater instead of fresh water, and it started happened in Jordan Valley. They started in the southern part of Jordan Valley, in central part, and recently they start pumping that in a limited part and northern part of Jordan Valley. But they will, or the plan for the Ministry of Agriculture is to increase the portion of treated wastewater to be used in agriculture under specific criteria in order to save the drinking water. Sorry to take a lot of time, but it's a subject that I can't speak about it for 2 days. Sorry.
So Hussam, do you have anything to add to that? And I'll also address another question to you after that as
Yes.
well. It's coming for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Stefan, for this excellent question. So basically, the question is why these narratives have been around for so long and things have not improved and the narratives have not changed. Basically, what I would argue is that the narratives and the discourses really reflect the political economy of the water sector. And the political economy of the water sector has not changed much in the past 20 to 30 years. So we still have a similar allocation of water resources, still large agribusinesses that are strongly benefiting, and therefore it is really a challenge. But what has changed in the meantime is the sense of urgency. So in the meantime, since 20, 30 years ago, compared to 20, 30 years ago, the population has increased. The groundwater resources have decreased in terms of quality and quantity. So what has changed is the urgency on the solutions. So the government has been pushing, and what has changed in the past 30 years is that the DC project is now implemented and operational, and the government is really pushing for the desalinization. So it's really seeing this as a national priority. And finally, why has not changed? And going back to political economy, it's really about long-term vision and so the sustainability and short-term shocks and the urgency to try to face the short-term. And usually everywhere in the world, those that are in the government and the politicians are usually more concerned with securing water today and more than considering the sustainability of the water sector. So there's this urgency. And finally, just to conclude, I mean, we are all aware of the broader situation, the political context in which Jordan is situated. So while the government, I remember, has always developed very comprehensive national water strategies, has always been faced with shocks, external shocks from regional conflicts, refugees, and other challenges they had to face. And therefore, the long-term vision has always had to adapt with new challenges. And that's probably why we are still in a severe water scarce situation in Jordan.
Okay, there is a question, maybe it's a quick one to answer, about the DC aquifer. It's essentially from David Wilmson. How long, if both Jordan and Saudi Arabia are drawing from it, how long, essentially, how long is the aquifer expected to last?
Maybe, I mean, I'm sure like also Martin and Majd are excellent on this question, but just maybe to say that I heard many different studies. I mean, from like 100 years to 50 years. So it really depends. Also on the fact that the aquifer is shared, as mentioned in the question, so it's also being withdrawn by Saudi Arabia. But the interesting thing, I think, and we also have Raya Stefan connected, who is like one of the experts on groundwater and international law, is that the agreement in 2015 says that the groundwater resources of the DC needs to be used not for agricultural uses, but for other uses, especially domestic uses. So I think that's an interesting aspect. I'm not sure, I'm not really, I haven't studied the situation in Saudi Arabia, so I'm not sure about how much water is being withdrawn on the other side, but maybe, I mean, both Martin and Majd have studied the DC situation, so they might want to add also.
Perhaps perhaps we can move to Martin. There are a couple of questions and comments to Martin, and Chris Perry has said excellent analysis as well. So picking up on this issue that farmers are working as well as farming off farm, how can they, what would happen? Could those you interviewed escape from farming? Did they want to? Would their land be absorbed into larger, more productive units? If you have any comment on that. There's also a question that you said you would like to answer from Livia Perosino, thank you, as well, if you'd like to address either of those questions.
Sure, I can address both. I think the starting point is that we might want to discontinue this agrarian romanticism, and I know this is a very harsh message for some, but farmers are not in this field because they love to do what they do, but they also have inherited land. And if you speak to farmers across the region, if you ask them, do you want your children to work in agriculture under these conditions? The answer is 90% no, unless you have larger units where they actually make profit. Farmers don't want their children to continue with this field. It's not just a phenomenon in the Arab world, it's a phenomenon globally. We don't pay attention to farmers. And, you know, we talked about him several times today. Tony Allen mentioned this all the time. We don't pay attention to farmers. We just think that farmers do such an important social and economical, environmental job. Yes, they do, but we don't value them. In order to value them, we need to also stop with this cheap food paradigm. Farmers need to get paid more. And this is a larger political economic discourse, because it means that people have to pay more for food. Can people pay more for food? Well, if I look at Lebanon at the moment, I don't think so, because they're already very, very much under pressure because of food expenditure. And yes, Chris Perry's point, what we need to do is to also look at inheritance law to stop the fragmentation of agricultural units, and, you know, identify ways that farmers can once again make money on the plot of land they farm in, and not just make money, but also then they need to be allocated water for which they need to account for. So it has to be properly metered, and it has to be enforced by local and regional government in the area. And a final thing, which is often overlooked, I think a huge opportunity is to look at rangeland management across the region. Rangelands could provide a lot of important protein to consumers. And, you know, I had a discussion with, actually with some Saudi officials about this a few weeks ago, and they said, well, we don't want to really address this issue because, well, you know, it's too difficult, it's too complex. Also because of inheritance laws, and, you know, you don't want to open up the Pandora's box. But in order to solve the water crisis, you need to open the Pandora's box. And this means also to challenge political power plays on the ground. Thank
you. Would anyone else like to add a comment on Martin's response from our panelists? Okay, we have a question then from Henry Hogger, who also is picking up on, I suppose, what do farmers want to do? Essentially, it is there a politically viable way to encourage farmers to reduce their water use? Looking, I think, at Hussam's sort of charts of the amount of water that's used in agriculture relative to the percentage of employment. So if we maybe make this our final question, if you have any comments, either Hussam or Majd, on this one.
Yes, maybe I can start by saying that it's important to support the rural development and at the same time job creation. So job creation in rural areas to ensure and to try to prevent this rural to urban migration, which usually brings urban poverty. And so it's really, I think, the responsibility of the government to try to, I mean, in Jordan, but elsewhere, I think that's really applicable to anywhere, to try to clarify what the economic development trajectories are and should be. And accordingly to try to develop from ecotourism, for instance, or the industrial sector, or a different type of doing agriculture in order to try to maintain people in rural areas and trying to develop these rural areas in a water wise way. That's what I really would say.
Okay. Thank you, Hussam, and thank you, Carol. If I might add, okay, in order to the farmers to reduce their water consumption, then they need to increase the water use efficiency at farm level. Talking about this, then I will back to the recommendation that I highlighted at the end of my presentation. We need to aspect the technology aspect and the knowledge aspect and the capacity building. One of the projects that we conducted at Wana Institute, it was related to the future and the challenges for the agriculture sector in Jordan. We interviewed several farmers from the Jordan Valley, and we asked them about the terminology itself. Are they aware about the water productivity terminology, about the water use efficiency? Some farmers have a good knowledge about that, but unfortunately, some farmers do not know anything about water productivity. They only apply water to the crops when they have water, and etc. So what I'm trying to say, if we need to increase the water use efficiency and reduce the water consumption by farmers and decrease the water losses at farm level, then we need to provide the users with the technology, and providing this technology, then we need financial aspects, and also we need to provide them with the knowledge, with the capacity building, how to use this technology in a friendly way and a good way in order to achieve sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are now just past our hour and a half. So it really remains for me to thank all our expert speakers here today for all of their presentations and for the discussion and their comments, and to say thank you to you for joining us, and that CBRL runs a number of online events. I'll just put in the chat, please check our website. Today we've been covering water problems, but we cover social sciences and humanities research broadly, with a program that is a program that we also encourage you to get in contact with us if there's something that you would like us to cover as well. So I think with that, I'm going to sign off for today. Thank you again for your attendance, and thank you once again to all our expert speakers. And we continue to think on these topics again, particularly at this time, as it's not going away, and with COP26 in view, and also just to thank you to all of those, and our small tribute to the work of Tony Allen in this presentation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.